In the grand village of Nkokwana, where power and wealth determined a person's worth, Lumina grew up knowing she was different. She had been adopted as a baby, taken in by the influential Mansa and his wife, Aisha, but instead of love, she was given reminders, constant, painful reminders, that she did not belong. She was not their real daughter. She was simply a burden they had carried out of obligation, while Mansa and Aishi's biological daughters were treated like princesses, wrapped in the finest fabrics and adorned with gold. Lumina lived in the shadows of their luxury. Her clothes were old, her meals were leftovers, and her place was not at the table with the family, but in the kitchen, doing the work of a servant. She cleaned their grand house, served food to the very sisters who looked down on her, and listened as they laughed at her behind her back. No matter how hard she tried to win their love, it was never enough. The villagers whispered about her misfortune, feeling pity for the girl who was treated as an outsider in her own home. But no one dared to speak up. Mansa was a powerful man, and crossing him meant risking everything. So Lumina endured, swallowing her pain, dreaming of the day she could finally be free from the house that never truly felt like home. But fate had its own plans, and soon everything in Lumina's life would change, forever. As the years passed, Lumina blossomed into a strikingly beautiful young woman. Her deep brown eyes held a quiet strength, and her radiant presence was impossible to ignore. Though she wore the simplest of clothes and was treated like a servant, she possessed a natural grace that even the wealthiest daughters of Nkokwane could not match. Her beauty did not go unnoticed. Suitors began arriving at Mansa's grand home, seeking her hand in marriage. Some were merchants, some were warriors, and a few even came from noble families. They had heard whispers of Lumina's kindness and intelligence, and despite her humble position, many were drawn to her. But this attention enraged her stepsisters. They had grown up believing they were superior to Lumina in every way, yet here she was, stealing the admiration they believed belonged to them. Their jealousy burned like fire, and they could not allow Lumina to rise above them. Eshi, their mother, saw the danger as well. If Lumina married well, she would no longer be under their control. She could gain power, respect, and a life beyond their grasp. That was unacceptable. So Aishi did what she did best. She poisoned the truth. Whenever a suitor came asking for Lumina's hand, Eshi would lower her voice and shake her head sorrowfully. "It is kind of you to ask," she would say, pretending to be burdened by a heavy secret. "But I must tell you the truth. Lumina is of unknown blood. She was abandoned as a baby. She could be the daughter of criminals, beggars, or worse. Would you really want such a woman to bear your children?" The suitors hesitated. In Nkokwane, bloodline meant everything. A wife's heritage was a mark of honor or disgrace. One by one, the men who had come with hopeful hearts turned away, ashamed for ever considering Lumina as a match. Soon, the proposals stopped coming altogether. The whispers spread throughout the village. Lumina was unworthy. Lumina did not understand why. Despite her beauty and kindness, no one wanted to marry her. She felt something was wrong, but she had no power to question it. Then, one evening, as the sun painted the sky in deep orange and gold, Mansa called her into the grand hall. He sat in his high-backed chair, his face as emotionless as stone. Eshi stood beside him, her arms crossed, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. "Tomorrow," Mansa said, his voice cold, "you will marry Rogato, the fisherman." The word struck Lumina like a blow. Rogato, the poor fisherman who lived by the sea. She had spoken to him a few times. He was kind, but he was nothing like the men who had once come to court her. He had no wealth, no status, nothing that would lift her from the life she desperately wanted to escape. Her heart pounded in her chest as she searched Mansa's face for any sign of mercy, but there was none. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You cannot force me." Eshi let out a soft laugh, stepping forward. "You should be grateful we are marrying you off at all," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "A girl like you should be thankful for even a fisherman." Lumina clenched her fists, fighting the tears that burned behind her eyes. She wanted to scream, to beg, to run, but she knew the truth. She had no choice. She had never had a choice. Her entire life had been dictated by the whims of this family, and now they were throwing her away like an unwanted possession. That night, as she lay in her small, cold room, she stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her fate pressing down on her. Tomorrow, she would be married to a man she barely knew. Tomorrow, she would be sent away from the only home she had ever known, even if that home had never truly been hers. But what Lumina didn't know was that fate had its own plans. The very man they were forcing her to marry, the fisherman they all looked down upon, was not who they thought he was. And soon, the world would see that the girl they discarded was destined for something far greater than they had ever imagined. The morning of Lumina's wedding felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As the sun rose over the village of Nkokwana, she stood quietly as the servants wrapped a simple cloth around her body. There were no golden ornaments, no fine silks, no intricate braids woven into her hair, as there had been for her stepsisters on their wedding days. There was no music, no celebrations, no well-wishers. Mansa and Escher had ensured that Lumina was sent away in silence, like a problem finally solved. Her heart pounded as she was led to the village outskirts where Rogato, the fisherman, was waiting for her. He stood by the shore, his strong hands adjusting the fishing nets beside his small hut. His skin was darkened by years of labor under the sun, his body built from the strength of the sea. But what caught Lumina off guard was his expression, calm, steady, and unreadable. He wasn't eager, nor did he look at her with the disdain she had grown so used to. Instead, he simply nodded and took her hand, leading her into his home without a word. The hut was small and modest, a sharp contrast to the grand home she had grown up in. There were no marble floors, no golden chandeliers, no servants to wait on her. The scent of salt and wood filled the air, and the sound of crashing waves was ever present. Yet, strangely, she felt something unfamiliar in this place. Peace. There were no harsh words from Escher, no cruel laughter from her stepsisters, no reminders that she was unwanted. For the first time in her life, she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder. At first, she kept to herself, bitter and angry at her fate. She barely spoke to Rogato beyond what was necessary. She would sit by the window and stare at the sea, wondering how her life had come to this. But as days passed, she began to notice things about him, things that made her uneasy, curious, and intrigued all at once. Unlike the other fishermen, Rogato never complained about the sea. While the others would curse the harsh waves and unpredictable tides, he seemed to understand them, as if the ocean spoke to him. He moved with a quiet confidence, carrying himself in a way that didn't match his simple life. His hands were rough from work, yet when he held a fishing knife or mended a net, his movements were precise, too precise. But it was his mind that confused her the most. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he began telling her stories, not of fish or storms, but of kings, warriors, and fallen empires. His voice was deep and mesmerizing, painting vivid images of battles fought in distant lands, of rulers who had risen and fallen, of betrayals and victories that had shaped history. She listened, captivated, before finally asking, "How do you know these stories?" Rogato simply smiled, his eyes glinting in the firelight. A man learns many things in his lifetime, but Lumina was not satisfied with this answer. He was no ordinary fisherman. Of that, she was sure. The more time she spent with him, the more strange things she began to notice. Whenever warriors or traders passed through the village, they barely acknowledged the other fishermen. But when they saw Rogato, something changed in their expressions. Some would lower their heads slightly, almost as if in respect. Others would pause, as if recognizing him, but choosing to say nothing. One day, an elderly merchant came to sell spices by the shore. As soon as he caught sight of Rogato, his hands trembled and his eyes widened in shock. He nearly dropped the basket he was holding. "Your Majesty," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible. Lumina's breath caught in her throat. She turned to Rogato, expecting him to react, to deny it, to demand an explanation. But he simply placed a few coins in the merchant's hand. his face unreadable, and walked away as if nothing had happened. From that moment on, Lumina could not ignore the feeling in her chest, the certainty that Rogato was hiding something. He was no ordinary fisherman. He spoke like a scholar, moved like a warrior, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had once known power. But who was he? And why was he living in secrecy? She wanted to ask. She wanted to demand the truth, but something inside her told her that whatever secret Rogato carried, it was far bigger than she could imagine, and when the time was right, the world would come to know it too. Lumina had always known there was something different about Rogato, but she had never questioned it too deeply. He was kind, intelligent, and unlike anyone she had ever met. But as time passed, strange clues began to surface, things that didn't make sense for a simple fisherman. One evening, while Rogato was out at sea, Lumina decided to clean their small hut. She had grown accustomed to the simplicity of their life, but as she moved a wooden chest to sweep the floor, something inside rattled. Curious, she lifted the lid and gasped. Inside, wrapped in a fine cloth, was a collection of jewelry unlike anything she had ever seen. Gold chains, rings with emeralds, bracelets inlaid with rubies. All of them looked like they belonged to a king's treasury. Her heart pounded. Why would a poor fisherman have such treasures? She picked up a heavy pendant and examined it closely. The emblem on it looked familiar, but she couldn't quite place where she had seen it before. It was intricate, regal, something only worn by royalty. A strange feeling crept into her chest. Who was Rogato? She decided to say nothing, but her mind couldn't rest. Days later, as they walked through the marketplace, an elderly merchant caught sight of Rogato and gasped so loudly that people turned to look. The man's hands trembled, his face turning pale. "Your Majesty," the merchant whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. His eyes darted around, as if afraid someone else would hear. Lumina's breath hitched. She turned to Rogato, expecting him to laugh or dismiss the old man's words. But instead, Rogato's expression hardened. In one swift movement, he stepped forward and placed a firm hand on the merchant's shoulder. "You are mistaken, old man," he said in a calm but warning tone. "I am just a fisherman." The merchant opened his mouth to argue, but Rogato's grip tightened slightly, a silent message. The old man swallowed hard and nodded quickly, lowering his gaze. Without another word, Rogato guided Lumina away, his posture stiff. But Lumina could no longer ignore the truth clawing at her mind. Why would a merchant mistake him for royalty? Why had Rogato reacted so sharply? It wasn't the reaction of an innocent man. It was the reaction of someone with something to hide. Her suspicions deepened when danger came knocking on their door. One night, as they returned from the marketplace, a group of robbers emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. Their faces were covered with scarves, their eyes gleaming with greed. "Wow, wow," one of them sneered, twirling a dagger between his fingers. "Hand over your gold, fisherman." Lumina's stomach twisted in fear. She knew Rogato had some coins from selling his fish, but not enough to satisfy these men. And if they didn't have enough, the robbers might decide to take something else. Her. She reached for Rogato's arm, ready to beg him to run. But before she could speak, something shocking happened. Rogato moved. Not like a frightened fisherman, not like a desperate man trying to protect his wife, but like a warrior. In the blink of an eye, he reached for a wooden staff resting against a nearby stall and swung it with such precision that it knocked the dagger clean from the robber's hand. The man barely had time to react before Rogato spun, dodging another attacker's strike with ease. His movements were effortless, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The remaining robbers hesitated, glancing at each other in alarm. They had expected an easy target, not a trained fighter. Rogato's stance, the way he anticipated their every move, it was not the way a simple fisherman fought. One of the men, sensing danger, cursed under his breath. "Forget it, he's not worth it," he muttered, before turning and running. The others quickly followed, disappearing into the night. Lumina stood frozen, staring at Rogato as he calmly set the staff aside as if nothing had happened. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're not just a fisherman." Rogato met her gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, She thought he might finally tell her the truth, but then he simply gave her a small, knowing smile and walked past her. Lumina clenched her fists, her mind racing. The jewelry, the merchant, the way warriors bowed their heads when they saw him. And now this, a man who fought with the skill of a trained warrior. Who was Rogato? She was determined to find out. The evening was calm, the sky painted in hues of orange and deep purple as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Lumina sat outside their small hut, staring at the waves rolling onto the shore. The past few weeks had been filled with strange encounters, unanswered questions, and a growing suspicion that the man she had married was not who he claimed to be. Then, the sound of galloping hooves shattered the peaceful silence. She turned her head sharply, her heart pounding, as a group of riders appeared on the horizon. Their armor gleamed under the fading sunlight, their royal blue capes billowing behind them. The villagers, who had been going about their evening routines, froze at the sight. Whispers spread like wildfire, eyes widening in fear and confusion. The riders came to a halt right in front of Rogato's hut. Without hesitation, they dismounted, moving in perfect unison. And then, to Lumina's utter shock, they did something unthinkable. They kneeled. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, lowered his head and spoke in a deep, unwavering voice. "Prince Rogato, it is time to return. The throne awaits you." Lumina's breath caught in her throat. "Prince?" She turned to look at Rogato, expecting to see surprise, confusion, anything to indicate that this was a mistake, but instead he simply sighed, running a hand through his thick curls. It was not the reaction of a man who had just learned shocking news. It was the reaction of a man who had known all along. Her legs felt weak beneath her. The man she had been forced to marry, the humble fisherman who had taken her in with kindness, the man who fought like a warrior and carried himself with quiet authority. He was not a fisherman at all. He was a prince. Rogato finally looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. Regret, relief, perhaps both. "I wanted to tell you," he said softly. Lumina shook her head. "Tell me what? That you're a prince? That you've been hiding right under everyone's noses?" The head guard stood, his voice cutting through the thick tension. "Your Highness, the kingdom needs you. The people have suffered long enough under the false king's rule." Lumina's mind spun. "What does he mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rogato exhaled slowly before stepping forward. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for. "I was born as the rightful heir to the kingdom of Ukuta," he admitted. "But when I was a child, a coup overthrew my father. The rebels knew they couldn't let me live, so they planned to kill me. But my most loyal guards managed to smuggle me out of the palace." Lumina's lips parted in shock, but she couldn't speak. "I was hidden among commoners, given a new identity, and told never to reveal who I was. For years I lived as an ordinary man, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was mine." He paused, his eyes softening. "Then I met you." She couldn't breathe. Every piece of the puzzle suddenly fit together. The strange way people reacted to him, his knowledge of royal customs, his unmatched skill in combat. He had been hiding in plain sight. "The time has come," the guard said firmly. "The people are ready to rise against the tyrant who stole your throne, but they need their true king." Lumina's heart raced. She had spent her whole life believing she was worthless, cast aside like an unwanted burden. But now, the man she had been forced to marry was not just anyone. He was the future king of an entire kingdom. And she, the orphaned girl who had been treated like a servant, was now the wife prince. The journey back to the palace was unlike anything Lumina had ever experienced. For years, she had been treated as nothing more than a burden, an unwanted girl cast aside by those who were supposed to love her. Now, she was riding beside a prince. No, a king. As they travelled through villages and towns, news spread like wildfire. The lost prince had returned. People lined the roads, their eyes wide with disbelief and joy. Some wept, some bowed, and others simply stared, unable to believe that the young fisherman who had lived among them was actually their rightful ruler. But it was not just Rogato they looked at. It was her too. The same girl who had once been invisible now sat on horseback beside the future king, and for the first time in her life, people looked at her with admiration instead of pity. The palace of Ukuta was nothing like the home she had known in Kokwane. It was grander, more magnificent, with golden gates that stretched high into the sky and banners that fluttered in the wind. Servants rushed to greet them, their faces lighting up as they fell to their knees before Rogato. "Your Majesty, you have returned," they cried. But Lumina was the one who felt out of place. As they entered the royal halls, she could barely process what was happening. Everything was so different, so overwhelming. She was led to a chamber where women dressed in fine silks welcomed her with warm smiles. They bathed her in scented water, brushed her hair until it shone, and draped her in the richest fabrics she had ever touched. Gold bangles jingled around her wrists, and a jeweled crown was placed upon her head. She barely recognized herself. The girl who had once worn rags, who had been treated no better than a servant, now looked like a queen. When she stepped out into the grand hall, where the nobles and warriors of Ukuta had gathered, a hush fell over the crowd. They saw her, truly saw her, and for the first time in her life, she felt worthy. Rogato turned to look at her, his eyes filled with something deep and unspoken. Pride, admiration, something she had never received from anyone before. Then he took her hand and led her to the throne beside him. The people erupted in cheers. Their king had returned, and beside him sat a woman who had been cast aside by one family, only to rise as the queen of another. Lumina had been nothing in the eyes of those who raised her, but now she was everything. When the news reached Nkokwan, Mansa and Eshe could hardly believe their ears. The orphan girl they had treated as nothing more than a servant, the girl they had cast aside without a second thought, was now sitting beside a king. Lumina, the daughter they never truly accepted, had risen higher than they could have ever imagined. Eshi's hands trembled as she clutched the messenger's arm. "Are you sure? This cannot be true," she gasped. The man nodded solemnly. "Prince Rogato has returned to reclaim his throne, and Lumina is with him. She is no longer an orphan or a burden. She is the future queen." Mansa's face drained of colour. He had spent years making sure Lumina knew she was beneath his own daughters, making sure she never felt worthy of love or respect. Now, the same girl he had tossed aside held more power than he ever would. His heart pounded in his chest. If Lumina wanted revenge, she could destroy them both with a single word. Without hesitation, Mansa and Eshe gathered their finest garments and set out for the palace, their minds racing with fear and desperation. As they approached the golden gates of Ukuta, they saw crowds of people celebrating in the streets, singing songs of their prince's return. The very thought made Mansa's stomach turn. They were allowed inside, but the moment they stepped into the grand palace halls, they felt small. The towering walls, the gleaming floors, the guards standing at attention, everything reminded them of the power Lumina now possessed. And then they saw her. She was dressed in a flowing gown of deep blue, embroidered with golden threads. A delicate crown rested on her head, and her posture was no longer that of a timid, unwanted girl. She sat beside Rogato, her expression calm yet unreadable. Eshi's eyes filled with tears as she fell to her knees. "Lumina, my daughter, we were wrong," she cried. "Please forgive us. We did not know who you truly were." Mansa quickly followed, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the marble floor. "Forgive us, my queen," he pleaded. "We were blind. We did not see your worth." The entire court watched in silence, waiting for Lumina's response. This was the moment she could demand justice. She could punish them, humiliate them, cast them out just as they had done to her. But Lumina only gazed down at them, her face unreadable. The girl they had once treated like nothing was now the one who held their fate in her hand. The grand hall of the palace fell silent as Lumina rose from her seat. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting, holding their breath. Before her, Mansa and Eshe knelt, trembling, their once proud faces now filled with fear and desperation. The villagers had gathered outside the palace, whispering among themselves, eager to see what Lumina would do. They had all witnessed the way Mansa and Eshe had treated her, how they had belittled her, cast her aside like she was nothing. Now, the tables had turned. Mansa's voice cracked as he spoke. "We were blinded by our own arrogance, Lumina. We failed you." His head remained bowed, his pride shattered. Eshe's tears streamed down her face as she clasped her hands together. "Please, my child, show us mercy." The entire court waited, expecting Lumina to take her revenge. She had every right to. She could banish them from the kingdom, strip them of everything they had once taken pride in. She could make them feel the same humiliation, the same worthlessness they had forced upon her for years. But Lumina did not speak right away. She studied them, their pitiful figures kneeling before her, once so powerful, now so weak. Then, after a long pause, she smiled softly. "A queen's strength is in her heart," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "I forgive you." Gasps echoed throughout the hall. The villagers outside murmured in shock. The very people who had treated her like a servant, who had made her feel unwanted, were being forgiven. Mansa and Eshe's eyes widened in disbelief. "You forgive us?" Eshe whispered, barely able to believe what she was hearing. "Yes," Lumina said, nodding. "But hear me well. I may forgive you, but you will never hold power over me again." She turned to the gathered nobles and guards. "From this day forward, Mansa and Eshe will remain in Ukuta, but they will no longer live as nobles. They will no longer sit in places of power, no longer command others as they once did." Mansa's face paled. Eshe let out a quiet sob. "You will live as humble citizens," Lumina continued, "and every day you will walk through this kingdom knowing that the girl you once saw as nothing is now its queen." The hall erupted in cheers. The villagers outside began to chant her name, their voices ringing through the air. They had expected vengeance, but instead they had witnessed something far greater: justice, wisdom, and true strength. Mansa and Eshe lowered their heads, accepting their fate. They had spent their lives chasing status, believing that worth came only from power and wealth. Now they had lost everything, except the lesson they would carry for the rest of their days. Lumina turned away, stepping back toward her throne. She had spent her life being told she was not enough, that she did not belong. But now, standing tall, with her people cheering her name, she knew the truth. She had always been worthy, and now the whole world knew it too. Lumina and Rogato stood side by side, no longer just husband and wife, but rulers of a kingdom that had been waiting for justice and kindness. Together, they led not with fear or arrogance, but with wisdom and compassion. The people of Ukuta adored their new queen, for she understood their struggles in a way no royal ever had. She'd once lived among them, suffered like them, and fought for her place in the world. And now she was their protector, their guiding light. Rogato, the prince who had once lived in hiding, embraced his role as king with grace. He and Lumina worked tirelessly to undo the wrongs of the past, ensuring that no child would be treated as she had been, that no one would be cast aside for circumstances beyond their control. The villagers spoke of Lumina's journey with awe. They told stories of how she had been nothing more than a servant, mistreated and ignored, only to rise as a queen. Children whispered her name as they played, dreaming that they too could one day overcome anything. In time, Mansa and Eshe faded into the background, forced to live among the commoners. No longer powerful, no longer feared, they watched as Lumina flourished. Each day, they saw the love and respect she received, knowing that they had once denied her those very things. It was a punishment far greater than exile, living with the knowledge that the girl they had treated as worthless had become the most powerful and beloved woman in the kingdom. Years passed, and under Lumina and Rogato's rule, Ukuta thrived. The kingdom became a place of fairness and hope, where people were judged not by their birth but by their hearts. And so, the orphaned girl who had once been thrown aside became the queen who would never be forgotten. Fate moves in ways no one can predict. Mansa and Eshe once believed that Lumina was beneath them, a burden they were forced to carry. They treated her as nothing more than a servant, never imagining that the girl they looked down upon would one day hold more power than they ever did. But destiny had its own plans. Lumina's name spread throughout the kingdom, whispered in admiration. She was living proof that a person's worth was not decided by birth, but by strength, kindness, and resilience. The villagers who once pitied her now looked up to her, and the nobles who once ignored her now bowed in respect. Mansa and Escher, once feared and powerful, found themselves lost in the shadows of their own mistakes. They had believed that power and status made them untouchable, but when everything changed, they were left with nothing but regret. They had underestimated Lumina, thinking she would always remain beneath them, never realizing that the one they mistreated would one day have the power to decide their fate. Under Lumina and Rogato's rule, the kingdom flourished. Justice replaced corruption, and no longer was a person's value determined by bloodline alone. Those once overlooked found opportunities they had never imagined. Lumina ensured that no child would suffer as she had, that no one would be cast aside because of their past. Her name traveled beyond the borders of Ukuta, reaching distant lands and inspiring those who had been told they were not enough. Her journey became a lesson. Never underestimate someone based on where they come from. The people who are mistreated today may rise above everyone tomorrow, and sometimes the greatest destinies are hidden in the most unexpected places.